At the exact moment this happened, the people of this island had no name for what was coming, because nothing like it had ever happened to anyone, anywhere, in the recorded history of the human species. In a single week, possibly in a single day, one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age simply vanished. Not conquered, not burned by invaders, not starved by famine. Erased so completely and so suddenly that for over 3,000 years, almost nobody on Earth knew it had ever existed. When archaeologists finally broke through the volcanic ash that had sealed this city for 35 centuries, they found streets, multi-story buildings, and a drainage system more advanced than anything Europe would build again for another 2,000 years. They found paintings so vivid the colors still looked wet. But they found something else too, something that still keeps historians awake at night. They found almost no bodies, not one skeleton in the ruins of a city built for thousands of people. Something had warned them. Something had given them time to run. And what came after they ran was so violent it reshaped the geography of the Aegean Sea, and may have inspired one of the most famous legends in human history. This is the entire story of Akrotiri, the Bronze Age city on the island of Thera, from its rise as a hub of Mediterranean trade to the eruption around 1600 BC that some historians believe gave birth to the myth of Atlantis. Long before its final destruction, Akrotiri was not a mysterious ruin. It was a living, breathing, thriving port city, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated settlements anywhere in the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. Located on what is now the island of Santorini, though in that era the island was shaped very differently, roughly circular rather than the crescent moon it is today, Akrotiri sat at a critical crossroads of ancient maritime trade. Ships moving between Crete, mainland Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant frequently passed through or stopped at this island. Akrotiri grew rich on exactly the kind of commerce that made such crossroads valuable in the ancient world. The city's origins stretch back centuries before its final destruction. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous habitation on the site from as early as the Neolithic period, meaning that by the time of its destruction, people had already been living on this small patch of volcanic earth for thousands of years. But it was during the late Bronze Age, roughly corresponding to the height of Minoan civilization on nearby Crete, that Akrotiri transformed from a modest settlement into something genuinely extraordinary. A planned urban center, multi-story buildings, sophisticated infrastructure, an artistic culture that rivaled anything produced anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world at that time. The relationship between Akrotiri and the great Minoan civilization based on Crete remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. But the connection is undeniable. Akrotiri's pottery, its architectural techniques, its religious iconography, and above all, its extraordinary wall paintings share deep stylistic and technical similarities with Minoan art found on Crete itself. Many archaeologists consider Akrotiri either a Minoan colony, a close trading partner deeply influenced by Minoan culture, or an independent society that had absorbed Minoan artistic and religious traditions through sustained contact. Whatever the precise political relationship, the cultural connection placed Akrotiri firmly within the orbit of the most advanced civilization in the Bronze Age Aegean. Minoan Crete's palaces at Knossos, its elaborate bureaucratic systems, and its command of maritime trade routes made it the dominant power of the region for centuries. Akrotiri, whatever its exact status, benefited enormously from this proximity to Minoan wealth, technology, and artistic sophistication, absorbing ideas, techniques, and trading partners through a relationship that appears to have been far closer than that of a distant admirer. The city that archaeologists have gradually uncovered since serious excavation began in the 1960s reveals urban planning that would not seem out of place in a far later era of human history. Buildings rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories high, constructed with sophisticated masonry techniques and featuring interior staircases connecting multiple floors, a detail that surprised early excavators who had not expected such vertical density in a settlement this old. The streets were paved and organized in a manner suggesting deliberate urban design rather than haphazard organic growth, with clear evidence of planning committees or authorities coordinating construction across different districts of the city. A drainage and sewage system ran beneath the city, channeling wastewater away from living spaces. This was a level of civic engineering many later Mediterranean and European cities would not achieve again until well into the modern era. Some buildings even show evidence of what appear to be indoor plumbing systems, with clay pipes designed to carry water to upper floors, a technological detail that continues to astonish visitors touring the excavated site today. The wealthier households of Akrotiri enjoyed comforts that would have seemed extraordinary to visitors from less developed regions of the contemporary world. Comforts that would not become common again in much of Europe for well over 2 millennia. Perhaps nothing captures the sophistication of Akrotiri more vividly than its wall paintings. Frescoes preserved in remarkable condition, precisely because of the volcanic ash that would eventually bury the city and, in a strange twist of fate, protect its most fragile treasures from the ravages of time. These paintings, discovered still clinging to the walls of buildings that had stood empty and buried for 3,500 years, depict scenes of breathtaking detail and beauty. Ships in full sail crossing between painted coastal towns, blue monkeys climbing through fields of golden crocus flowers, young boxers with shaved heads and elaborate jewelry facing off in ritual combat, swallows swooping through fields of red lilies in a celebration of spring, fishermen carrying strings of freshly caught fish, rendered with such anatomical precision that marine biologists today can identify the exact species depicted. Elegant young women, their hair elaborately styled, dressed in flounced skirts and jewelry, gathering saffron from crocus flowers in what appears to be a religious ritual rather than simple agricultural labor. These were not crude decorative sketches. They were the work of master artists working within a sophisticated visual tradition. Artists whose skill and whose subject matter reveal a society deeply engaged with the sea, with trade, with religious ritual, and with an almost joyful celebration of the natural world around them. The economy that sustained this remarkable urban culture rested, as it did throughout the Bronze Age Aegean, overwhelmingly on maritime trade. Akrotiri's position made it a natural stopping point for ships moving goods across enormous distances, a small island punching dramatically above its geographic weight because of where it happened to sit on the map. Archaeological evidence recovered from the site confirms extensive trading contacts stretching from mainland Greece and the Cycladic Islands to Crete and beyond to Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and even Egypt. Pottery imported from these distant regions has been found throughout the excavated portions of the city, sitting in kitchens and storerooms exactly where their owners left them the day they walked away. Alongside this, evidence shows Akrotiri itself produced goods, particularly high-quality painted pottery and textiles, that were exported outward through the same trading networks, meaning the city was not merely a passive stop on someone else's trade route, but an active economic engine in its own right. Some scholars believe the island may also have played a role in the production or trade of a particular commodity that was extraordinarily valuable throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Saffron, harvested from the crocus flowers so lovingly depicted in the city's frescoes. A spice and dye whose value per unit of weight rivaled precious metals in certain periods of ancient commerce. Life in Akrotiri, based on everything the excavated ruins reveal, was materially comfortable, culturally rich, and deeply connected to a wider Bronze Age world stretching from Egypt to mainland Greece. The city had no defensive walls. Archaeologists find this detail particularly telling. It suggests either supreme confidence in naval protection, a broader regional peace maintained by Minoan maritime dominance, or simply a society that had never needed to prepare for land-based warfare. Furniture, though almost entirely decomposed over the millennia, left behind ghostly impressions in the volcanic ash. These impressions allowed archaeologists to create plaster casts revealing wooden beds, tables, and elaborately carved furniture legs, an almost impossibly intimate window into the domestic lives of people who had been dead for 3,500 years. Storage rooms throughout the city contained enormous ceramic vessels called pithoi, still holding traces of olive oil, wine, and grain. Evidence of a society that had mastered the agricultural and commercial systems necessary to sustain a substantial urban population, storing surplus with the same careful planning visible in every other corner of the city. But beneath the golden prosperity of this Bronze Age port city, the island itself was concealing a secret far older and far more dangerous than any human enemy Akrotiri's inhabitants could have imagined. The very ground beneath their elegant multi-story houses, the very earth that had made their agriculture so fertile and their harbor so useful, sat atop one of the most powerful volcanic systems in the entire Mediterranean basin. And sometime around 1600 BC, after generations, possibly centuries, of relative dormancy, that volcano began to wake up. For generations, life on the island followed a rhythm that felt permanent. Ships came and went. Traders unloaded goods on the docks. Children grew up watching the sea, learning the names of foreign ports before they learned to read. Nobody living in Akrotiri had ever felt the ground shake with real violence. The volcano beneath their island had been quiet for longer than anyone's grandparents could remember. To them, it was not a threat. It was simply the shape of home. But volcanoes do not forget, and the one sleeping beneath Thera was not an ordinary volcano. It sat above one of the most dangerous fault systems in the entire Mediterranean, a place where tectonic plates ground against each other with a force capable of reshaping coastlines. Modern geologists who have studied the site describe the magma chamber beneath ancient Thera as almost unimaginably large. A reservoir of molten rock that had been slowly, silently building pressure for centuries. Every year that passed without eruption was not a year of safety. It was a year of accumulation. The first signs, when they finally came, were small enough to ignore. Minor tremors. A faint smell of sulfur near certain coastal rocks. Perhaps a spring that ran a little warmer than it used to. Fishermen may have noticed unusual currents. Farmers may have noticed cracks appearing in fields that had never cracked before. Small things. Forgettable things. None of it would have seemed like the beginning of the end of the world. This is one of the cruelest patterns in the history of natural disasters. The warning signs are almost always there. They are almost always dismissed. Akrotiri, for all its sophistication, was no exception to this deeply human tendency to normalize slowly escalating danger. Archaeologists excavating the site found something remarkable, buried in the layers just beneath the final destruction. Cracked walls that had been hastily repaired. Streets partially cleared of fallen debris. Evidence, in other words, of an earlier earthquake. One significant enough to damage buildings, but not devastating enough to convince anyone to abandon their home permanently. This earlier tremor is now believed by many researchers to have been a precursor event, a seismic warning shot fired weeks or months before the true catastrophe. And in one of the most astonishing details to emerge from decades of excavation, it appears the people of Akrotiri eventually responded to the mounting signs exactly as they should have. They left. Not in panic, not in the chaotic, half-finished way people flee a city under sudden attack. The evidence suggests something closer to an organized evacuation. A population that packed up its most valuable possessions and walked away from everything else, likely by ship, likely toward Crete or other nearby islands, though their exact fate remains one of the great unanswered questions of the entire story. This is the detail that makes Akrotiri different from almost every other lost city in human history. There was no invading army. There was no siege. There were no signs of warfare, no weapons scattered among the ruins, no burned structures consistent with conquest. Instead, archaeologists found empty houses, furniture left behind, large storage jars still in place, but almost nothing of true value. No jewelry, no gold, no fine metalwork of the kind wealthy Bronze Age households would have owned. Even more strikingly, in several excavated buildings, doorways appear to have been deliberately blocked with stones and rubble, as if the residents were trying to protect their homes from looters, or perhaps from the earthquakes themselves before departing. The conclusion many scholars have reached is almost eerie in its implication. The people of Akrotiri knew something was wrong. They gathered what mattered most, and they left their city behind, expecting, perhaps, that they might one day return. They never did. But the story does not end with a quiet, empty city sitting under a darkening sky. What came next was one of the most violent explosions the ancient world had ever produced. An event so massive that its effects would ripple across the entire eastern Mediterranean for generations. While the people of Akrotiri had escaped the worst of it, the island they left behind was about to be torn apart by a force no Bronze Age civilization had words to describe. Modern volcanologists, studying the layers of ash and pumice that eventually buried the city more than 60 feet deep in places, have reconstructed the eruption with startling precision. And what they discovered ranks the Thera eruption among the most powerful volcanic events of the last 10,000 years of human history. The eruption did not begin with a catastrophic explosion that would eventually destroy the island. It began, as these events almost always do, with a prolonged and increasingly violent overture. Geologists studying the layered deposits at Akrotiri have identified several distinct phases of the eruption, each more destructive than the last, unfolding over a period that may have stretched across days or even weeks. The first phase produced a massive column of pumice and ash, rocketing high into the atmosphere and then falling back across the island in a thick, suffocating blanket. This initial ashfall, estimated by some researchers to have reached several feet in depth within hours, would have been the final unmistakable sign that the island was no longer safe for anyone who remained. It is this layer of ash, blanketing empty streets and abandoned buildings, that confirms the evacuation had already happened. The city preserved beneath it was a city without people, a city already left behind before the true violence began. As the eruption intensified, the volcano entered a phase that modern volcanologists classify among the most dangerous types of eruption known to science, a phase involving pyroclastic flows. These are surges of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic rock that move down the slopes of an erupting volcano at speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, incinerating and burying everything in their path within moments. Anyone who had remained on the island by this stage would have had no realistic chance of survival, a detail that makes the earlier evacuation seem, in hindsight, almost miraculously well-timed. Layer after layer of pyroclastic material, some of it still hot enough to leave burn marks on stone when it settled, buried Akrotiri under a shroud that would ultimately reach depths of over 20 meters in places. But the truly catastrophic moment, the one that scientists believe fundamentally altered the shape of the island and sent shockwaves through the ancient world, came when the eruption reached its final and most violent stage. As the magma chamber beneath the volcano continued to empty at a staggering rate, the ground above it, no longer supported by the molten rock that had once filled the space below, began to collapse. This is what volcanologists call a caldera collapse, and in the case of Thera, it was catastrophic in scale. A significant portion of the island's center collapsed downward and inward, and the sea rushed in to fill the void. The explosion associated with this final stage is estimated by many researchers to have been among the largest volcanic events of the last several thousand years, releasing energy on a scale difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend. Ash from the eruption has been found in ice cores in Greenland, in seabed sediment across the eastern Mediterranean, and in archaeological sites as far away as Egypt and Anatolia. Physical proof of just how far this single event reached. And then came the tsunami. When an island volcano undergoes a caldera collapse of this magnitude, the sudden displacement of the surrounding sea generates waves capable of devastating coastlines hundreds of kilometers away. Geological evidence recovered from coastal sites across Crete, some 70 miles to the south, shows tsunami deposits consistent with waves that may have reached heights of over 10 meters when they struck the northern shores of the island. For the great Minoan civilization on Crete, the very culture that had shaped so much of Akrotiri's own artistic and architectural identity, this tsunami likely represented a devastating blow. Coastal settlements and harbor towns, the beating economic heart of Minoan maritime power, would have been struck with little to no warning by a wave capable of erasing entire communities in minutes. Some historians and archaeologists have long debated whether the Thera eruption played a direct role in the eventual decline of Minoan civilization itself, a debate that continues among scholars to this day. While the destruction of the great Minoan palaces did not happen immediately after the eruption, but rather over the following decades, many researchers believe the eruption dealt a crippling blow to the economic and naval infrastructure that had sustained Minoan dominance of the Aegean for centuries. A civilization that had built its power on control of the sea suddenly found its harbors destroyed, its fleets damaged or lost, and its trade networks thrown into chaos, a wound from which it may never have fully recovered. Back on the island of Thera itself, the eruption's final act was almost unimaginable in its violence. Modern estimates place the volume of material ejected during the eruption at somewhere between 30 and 60 cubic kilometers, a figure that places Thera among the largest volcanic events documented anywhere on Earth in the last 10,000 years. For comparison, researchers studying both events have noted that the Thera eruption may have released several times more explosive energy than the infamous 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, an eruption whose sound was heard nearly 3,000 miles away and whose ash darkened skies across the planet for months. If Thera's eruption was even more powerful, as much of the geological evidence suggests, then the sound, the ash cloud, and the sheer atmospheric disruption it caused would have been experienced, in some form, across an enormous portion of the ancient world. Some climate scientists have pointed to disruptions in tree ring data and ice core records from this general period as possible evidence of the eruption's global atmospheric impact. Cooler summers, disrupted harvests, and unusual weather patterns recorded thousands of miles from the eruption itself. Ancient Egyptian records from a similar era describe unusual darkness and storms, and while scholars remain divided over whether these accounts can be directly linked to Thera, the possibility alone speaks to just how far the consequences of this single eruption may have traveled. When the ash finally settled and the sea calmed, the island that people had once called home no longer existed in the shape they had known it. What had been a roughly circular landmass was now a shattered ring of cliffs surrounding a vast flooded caldera, the physical geography of Thera permanently and violently rewritten in the span of what may have been only a matter of days. And somewhere beneath the layers of ash and pumice that now smothered the abandoned city, the empty streets, the painted walls, the furniture left behind by people who thought they might return one day, all of it sat sealed and silent, waiting more than 3,000 years to be found again. The rediscovery of Akrotiri did not happen quickly, and it did not happen by accident in the way many great archaeological discoveries do. The first hints that something extraordinary lay buried beneath the volcanic ash of Santorini emerged in the 19th century, when workers quarrying volcanic material for use in the construction of the Suez Canal stumbled upon ancient walls and pottery fragments buried deep beneath the surface. At the time, nobody fully understood what they had found. The fragments were curious, but the true scale of the buried city remained hidden for another 100 years. It would take another century and the vision of one determined archaeologist before the true scale of what lay hidden beneath the island was finally revealed. In 1967, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos began systematic excavations at the site, driven by a theory he had proposed decades earlier, that the eruption of Thera might be connected to the collapse of Minoan civilization on Crete. Marinatos had spent years defending this theory against skeptical colleagues who doubted a volcanic eruption could have had such a dramatic regional impact. The excavation at Akrotiri would ultimately prove to be the vindication of a lifetime's work. What Marinatos and his team uncovered exceeded even his own expectations. Layer after layer of ash peeled back to reveal an entire Bronze Age city, remarkably preserved, frozen in the exact moment its residents had walked away from it thousands of years before. The excavations continue to this day, and archaeologists estimate that only a fraction of the ancient city has been fully uncovered, meaning the most significant discoveries at Akrotiri may still lie ahead, buried and waiting beneath ground that has not yet been touched by a single excavator's tool. But it is the absence of bodies, more than almost anything else uncovered at the site, that has captured the public imagination and cemented Akrotiri's place in popular history. Unlike Pompeii, the Roman city famously buried by the eruption of Vesuvius, where the remains of victims caught in the moment of disaster were preserved in haunting detail, Akrotiri has yielded no confirmed human remains among its ruins. This single fact transforms the story from a straightforward tragedy into something closer to a genuine historical mystery. A city where the people vanished before the disaster rather than during it. It is precisely this mystery, this idea of an advanced, wealthy, artistically brilliant civilization that seemingly disappeared overnight, swallowed by fire and sea, that has led generations of scholars and enthusiasts alike to ask an irresistible question. Could Akrotiri be the origin of the legend of Atlantis? The myth of Atlantis, first recorded by the Greek philosopher Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, describes a magnificent island civilization, advanced beyond its neighbors, wealthy, powerful, and ultimately destroyed in a single catastrophic event, sinking beneath the sea in what Plato describes as a period of misfortune lasting no more than a day and a night. The parallels are difficult to ignore. An island civilization, sophisticated beyond its era, connected to the sea through trade and naval power, destroyed suddenly and completely, its physical landscape permanently altered by the very disaster that ended it. Many historians and archaeologists remain cautious about drawing a direct line between Akrotiri and Plato's Atlantis, noting that Plato's account includes numerous details, including a specific and much larger scale, along with a timeline placing Atlantis roughly 9,000 years before his own era, that do not neatly align with what is known about Thera and Akrotiri. Some scholars argue that Plato's Atlantis was, at least in part, a philosophical device, a story constructed to illustrate ideas about hubris, power, and the fragility of even the greatest civilizations, rather than a literal historical account passed down unaltered through the centuries. Yet, even among skeptics, many acknowledge that the memory of a real and genuinely catastrophic Bronze Age eruption, one that destroyed an advanced maritime civilization and altered the very shape of an island, could plausibly have echoed through generations of Mediterranean oral tradition, eventually reaching Plato in a transformed and mythologized version many centuries later. Whether or not Akrotiri is truly the seed from which the legend of Atlantis grew, the site's own story requires no myth to be extraordinary. What archaeologists have uncovered at Akrotiri represents one of the most complete and remarkably preserved windows into daily life in the Bronze Age anywhere in the world. A city that offers not just monuments and treasures, but genuine intimacy with how ordinary people lived, worked, worshipped, and created art nearly 36 centuries ago. The frescoes alone have transformed modern understanding of Bronze Age Aegean art, revealing a visual culture of extraordinary sophistication, technical skill, and emotional expressiveness that historians once assumed belonged only to far later periods of human civilization. The city's advanced infrastructure, its drainage systems, its multi-story buildings, and its apparent lack of visible extreme social stratification in the archaeological record, has led some researchers to view Akrotiri as evidence of a genuinely prosperous, broadly stable society, one that had built something remarkable in the brief centuries before the ground beneath it turned against it completely. Today, visitors to Santorini can walk through a portion of the excavated city under a massive protective roof, standing in streets that have not seen daylight in over 3,500 years, looking up at buildings whose second and third floors still stand exactly as their builders left them. The island itself, now shaped like a crescent moon curling around the flooded caldera left behind by the eruption, remains one of the most recognizable and most visited landscapes in the entire Mediterranean. Its dramatic cliffs and famous sunsets, a direct physical consequence of the very disaster that destroyed Akrotiri all those centuries ago. Every tourist who watches the sun set over Santorini's caldera today is, whether they realize it or not, looking at the scar left behind by one of the most powerful natural disasters in recorded human history. And somewhere beneath their feet, in streets not yet uncovered, in buildings not yet excavated, more of Akrotiri's story almost certainly still waits, sealed in ash, exactly as it was left on the day its people walked away and never came back. The city that vanished in a single day did not disappear because its people failed to notice the danger. It disappeared because, in the end, even the most advanced Bronze Age civilization in the Mediterranean could do nothing to stop the ground itself from tearing their world apart. But in choosing to leave when they still could, The people of Akrotiri left behind something that no eruption, no tsunami, and no collapsing caldera could ever fully erase. They left behind proof that they had been there, that they had built something beautiful, that for a brief, extraordinary window of Bronze Age history, a small island in the Aegean Sea had been home to one of the most advanced cities on Earth, and more than 3,000 years later, buried beneath layers of ash that once threatened to erase all memory of their existence. That proof is finally being brought back into the light.